right, so we're at the stage of the game where if we want to understand competitive rivalry, competitive dynamics, competitive behaviors, competitive responses, and competitive dynamics as a whole of the industry, we really need to do some in-depth competitor analysis at this point. Now, if you'll recall, in Chapter 2, we talked about doing an external environmental scan. We talked about specifically looking for opportunities and threats. And since our competitors are external to the company, they're also part of that scan, okay? And if you'll recall, I recommended that you take off your company hat and put on your competitor's hat and try to look at what the strengths and weaknesses are of that particular company, because if you can figure out your competitor's strengths and weaknesses, then you'll also be able to better understand the opportunities and threats in the marketplace. So when we try to figure out what our competitors are going to do, try to predict their actions, their responses, we need to understand them, obviously. We need to understand what their objectives are, what their current strategy is, what assumptions they're operating under, and what their capabilities are. So at this stage of the simulation with Globus, there is no resource dissimilarity, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Everybody has exactly the same set of resources, exactly the same products, exactly the same customers, okay? So their capabilities of what they can do with those products, those resources, is going to be exactly the same as yours. And at this stage of the simulation, quite frankly, it's really a lot like the Hunger Games. And I'm sure that all of y'all have either read the book or seen the series of movie Hunger Games, so you know what I'm talking about when I say that, okay? Once we understand our competitors, then we can begin to predict what we expect them to do as far as their actions and their responses, and hopefully avoid blind spots. We don't want to get blindsided by someone. Hopefully we can look inside of their objectives, their strategies, their assumptions, their capabilities, and figure out what they're trying to accomplish. Now keep in mind, we've got a relatively small industry with 8 firms, and 2 of those are being run by me. And I'm not actually competing against you. I'm going to use those 2 companies as a teaching example. Once our decision's processed tonight, I'll do a debrief with you and tell you specifically what I did for each of those companies. But what you want to do is you want to avoid competitive blind spots, and obviously the more competitors that you have, it can be a double-edged sword. It can be a positive thing to have few competitors. It can be a negative thing to have few competitors, because each competitor is going to possess a relatively large amount of market power. But we need to try to predict what they're going to do. We need to try to figure out their behavior, try to figure out where it is they're going. And once you have a couple of years of decisions under your belt, then you will have a better idea of what those competitors are trying to do, okay? So I mentioned the term market commonality and resource similarity in one of the earlier videos, okay? So the greater our market commonality, the greater our resource similarity, the more we know that we're direct competitors. And of course, direct competitors are those that are selling the same or very, very similar products in the same geographic markets. So we've got multi-market competition. If you'll recall, you're selling exactly the same products, you have exactly the same resources. So we would say that you've got high market commonality and high resource similarity, okay? So for your case specifically, you have 4 geographies, right? North America, Latin America, Europe, Africa, Asia Pacific, okay? That's multi-market competition. Those markets are the same importance to each of the competitors, because right now each competitor possesses 12.5% market share in each of those 4 geographic areas, okay? So obviously once the 2 companies that I'm running go away, after the 2 practice rounds, they'll go away, then you will have 6 competitors, and market share will be adjusted accordingly, okay? So with regards to resource similarity, if you've got the same types and amounts of resources, you tend to have the exact same strengths and weaknesses. So it's pretty easy to figure out your competitors when you have exactly the same stuff, right? They're just like you. What you don't know is what their strategy is going to be, and you don't know where they're going to try to go as a company. They're looking for opportunities and threats And it will be like the Hunger Games. Some people will run for the center of the arena and try to get the weapons, and some people will run for the hills and hide and try to figure out what other teams are going to do before they make a move. Okay, so it will be highly competitive. And honestly, when you look at Porter's 5 forces of competition, by far the most important uh, force of competition is the competitive rivalry, because everybody wants to win that simulation. Okay. If we look at a framework of competitive analysis or competitor analysis, we got 4 quadrants here: market commonality and resource similarity being our X and Y axis. If we have low market commonality and low resource similarity, right, then very little competition. If we have high market commonality and high resource similarity, right, there's going to be a tremendous amount of overlap. The textbook does a really good job of giving you some examples. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk those through, but you could think about head-to-head competitors of being companies like UPS and Federal Express. UPS and FedEx are direct competitors. They have very high market commonality and don't know so much about their resource similarity. Another example of somebody who has high market commonality with those and very low resource similarity is the United States Postal Service, because the Postal Service doesn't own any planes or big terminals, big hubs like what FedEx owns. So you can think through that process of resource similarity and market commonality to try to figure out what the level of competition is going to be. Let me just reassure you, in Globus, it's going to be highly competitive. It is a bloodbath. It is very much the Hunger Games as we get started.